A standing seam metal roof will outlive your tiny house trailer, your truck, your marriage, and possibly you. It can shrug off 140-mile-an-hour winds. It sheds snow like it's nothing. And if it's installed correctly, you will never think about your roof again for the next 50 years. But here's the problem. Most tiny house builders install it wrong. And the mistakes are the kind you can't see from the ground. They show up 3 winters later as a stain on your ceiling, right above your bed. Before we get into exactly what separates a roof that lasts 50 years from one that fails in 5, hit subscribe because this channel breaks down real building science with real 2026 numbers, no sponsors, no fluff. And stick around, because at the end I'm going to show you the one seam detail that pro crews guard closely and almost every DIY tutorial online leaves out. Let's start with why this roofing style even matters for a tiny house. Standing seam is a series of metal panels that run vertically from the ridge down to the eave, joined by raised seams with the fasteners hidden underneath. No exposed screw heads sitting in the sun for 20 years, slowly failing. That single design choice is why standing seam roofs are now rated for over 140 miles an hour of wind resistance when installed to spec, which matters a lot when your house is either sitting on a trailer or getting towed down the interstate at highway speed. For a full-size home, this roof is a splurge. For a tiny house, it's almost the opposite, because your roof might only be 100 to 200 square feet instead of 2,000. The total cost stops being scary and starts being one of the more reasonable upgrades on the whole build. Let's talk actual money, because this is where most videos either lowball you or scare you off completely. As of 2026, standing seam metal roofing runs roughly $10 to $18 per square foot fully installed for steel or aluminum. A simple inland install with a basic profile lands on the lower end, closer to $10 to $15 a square foot. Step up to a premium PVDF finish, the coating that resists fading and chalking for decades, and you're leaning towards $16 to $18 a square foot instead. Copper and zinc, if you're feeling fancy, will run you $20 to $40 a square foot, and on more architecturally complex builds, that number can actually push closer to $30 to $50 a square foot. For most tiny house builds, steel is the move. It's the budget-friendly option, and unless you're building 5 miles from the ocean, it holds up just fine. Here's the math that actually matters for a tiny house. If your roof footprint is around 150 square feet, and you're paying somewhere in that $10 to $18 range, you're looking at roughly $1,500 to $2,700 for the entire roof professionally installed. If you're doing it yourself, and I'll get into whether that's actually a good idea in a minute, bare 24-gauge Galvalume panels run roughly $2.20 to $4 per square foot before trim, clips, and fasteners. On a roof that size, that puts your materials only cost somewhere around $350 to $750. Add trim, sealant tape, and fasteners, and you're still coming in well below what a professional install would run you. That gap between $350 in materials and $1,500 installed is entirely labor, tooling, and expertise. Keep that number in your head, because it's exactly what you're paying for when you decide whether to hire this out or do it yourself. Compare that to the 50-year math nobody talks about. Asphalt shingles cost less up front, but they last 15 to 25 years. On a tiny house that gets bounced down highways and parked in direct sun with almost no attic buffer, that lifespan shrinks even further. Standing seam is rated for 40 to 70 years. You are very likely buying the last roof this house will ever need. So can you install this yourself? Builders in the tiny house community do it constantly, and it's genuinely one of the more DIY-friendly professional roofing systems, especially the snap lock version, which clicks together by hand with no specialized seaming machine required. The mechanical seam version needs an actual seaming tool that crimps the panels shut, and that tool alone can run you a couple $1,000s, which usually only makes sense if you're a contractor doing this repeatedly. For a tiny house roof, most builders go snap lock because the panels are short, the roof is small, and the tools required are basic. Tin snips, a hand seamer, a chalk line, and patience. That's genuinely most of the list. Before you order a single panel, you need to know your roof pitch because this decides which system will actually work on your house. The industry standard minimum for standing seam is 1/4 inch of rise per 12 inches of run, which is about a 2% slope. But that number is really only safe territory for mechanical seam systems. If you're going the simpler, more DIY-friendly snap lock route, you want a steeper minimum, generally 3 inches of rise per 12 inches of run. Why does this matter so much on a tiny house specifically? Because these roofs rely entirely on gravity to move water off. There's no membrane doing the heavy lifting underneath like on a flat commercial roof. If your pitch is too low, water sits in the panel ribs, and standing water on any metal roof eventually means corrosion, leaks, and on a tiny house, ice damming in the exact spot right above your bed. So check your pitch first. Everything else in this video assumes you've already cleared that bar. Here's a mistake that happens at the framing stage, long before the roof ever goes on, and it's specific to tiny houses because of how narrow these roofs are. Standing seam panels come in fixed widths, typically 12 to 19 inches. If you design your roof deck width without accounting for full panel widths, you end up needing a custom cut sliver panel at one edge, which is more expensive, harder to seal, and just looks off. The fix is simple. Plan your roof deck dimension to be a clean multiple of your chosen panel width, plus about an inch extra for the nailing flange that gets trimmed off at the edge. If you're using 12-inch panels and your roof needs to span around 100 inches, that's roughly 8 full panels, no odd leftover strip. Builders who plan this during framing save themselves a genuine headache during install, and often save money too, since custom-cut panels typically cost more. There's one more decision that gets skipped in almost every general roofing guide, because it barely matters on a house with a permanent foundation. It matters a lot to you. Standing seam panels typically come in 26 gauge or 24 gauge steel. 26 gauge is thinner, lighter, and cheaper. 24 gauge is thicker, more resistant to denting from hail or foot traffic, and noticeably more rigid, which helps prevent oil canning on longer panel runs. On a full-sized house, contractors will often just default to 24 gauge and call it a day. On a tiny house sitting on a trailer with a rated axle capacity, every pound you put on that roof is a pound you're not putting into your kitchen, your water tank, or your margin for road legal towing weight. Going from 26 gauge to 24 gauge across a full roof might only add a few dozen pounds, which sounds trivial until you're already fighting for every pound against your trailer's gross vehicle weight rating. If your tiny house is going to actually travel and not just sit permanently on a foundation, this is worth discussing with your panel supplier before you order. 26 gauge from a reputable manufacturer with a proper Kiner or PVDF finish is plenty durable for the vast majority of tiny house builds, and it's the choice most experienced tiny house builders actually make. While you're picking gauge, you're also picking a paint system, and this decision affects both your energy bill and your longevity, not just your curb appeal. There are 2 main coating types you'll run into: SMP, which is the cheaper option, and PVDF, sometimes sold under the name Kiner 500. PVDF costs more, typically 30 to 40% more than SMP for the same panel, but holds its color for decades without fading or chalking, and it comes with meaningfully longer paint warranties. On a roof you're hoping to never touch again for 50 years, that price difference is one of the more justifiable upgrades in this entire build. Color matters more on a tiny house than people expect too, because your attic buffer is minimal or non-existent. A dark charcoal roof looks incredible in photos, but it also absorbs significantly more heat than a lighter finish, and that heat has almost nowhere to go before it reaches your living space. Lighter colors or finishes specifically rated as cool roof coatings can meaningfully cut your interior cooling load, especially if you're parked somewhere with real summer sun. It's a genuine trade-off between aesthetic and comfort, and it's worth making on purpose rather than by accident. Before a single panel goes down, your roof deck needs to be clean, dry, flat, and free of anything that could puncture the underlayment or dent the panel from underneath. That means pulling every stray nail, screw, or staple. It means checking your OSB or plywood for any soft spots. On a tiny house, this inspection takes 20 minutes. Skipping it can cost you a leak that takes months to diagnose. Underlayment matters here more than people think. Skipping it, or using the wrong type, is one of the most common and easily avoidable mistakes in this entire build. A synthetic underlayment gives you a second line of defense against condensation, which is a real issue in a tiny house where interior humidity from cooking and showering has nowhere to go but up. Here's something almost nobody explains clearly, and it's the difference between a roof that lasts 50 years and one that starts failing at year 8. Metal expands and contracts with temperature. A lot. And on a tiny house with a small dark colored roof baking in direct sun with almost no attic space to buffer the heat, that expansion is more extreme than on a typical house roof. If your clips are fastened down too tight, the panel can't move. It has nowhere to go, so it buckles instead, creating that wavy, rippled look in the metal called oil canning. It's not just cosmetic. Fasteners tightened with too much torque, or clips forced into a seam that's slightly misaligned, create stress points that eventually crack the finish and let moisture in. The fix is counterintuitive if you've never done this before. Fasteners should go in with light resistance, not cranked down hard. If you can see the washer sitting off center, it's over-tightened. If the gasket isn't compressed firmly, it's under-tightened. There's a real sweet spot, and it's worth practicing on a scrap panel before you touch the actual roof. Here's the part that actually matters most on a snap lock system specifically. These panels are engineered to slide slightly within their clips or along a slotted fastening flange as the metal expands and contracts through the day. That sliding movement is not a flaw, it's the entire point of the design. If you drive a screw straight through that slot instead of through the clip the way it's designed to move, you just pin the panel in place. The very first hot afternoon, that panel has nowhere to expand, and something has to give. Usually it's a buckle in the field of the panel, sometimes it's a cracked screw hole that turns into a leak point a year later. Respect the slot. It's doing more work than it looks like it's doing. Now here's that seam detail I promised you at the start of this video. The one that separates a roof that performs for decades from one that looks fine for exactly one season. At the bottom edge of every panel, pros bend the metal over using a hand seamer to create a tight, consistent fold, usually around 7/8 of an inch, before locking it onto the eave starter strip. The trade calls this hemming the tail, and it's easy to say but genuinely hard to nail on every single panel. This hem fold has to be exact. Too tight, and the seam can't flex with temperature swings. Too loose, and wind can catch the bottom edge of the panel and start working it loose, which matters enormously on a house that spends its life either parked in open wind or getting hauled down a highway at 70 miles an hour. That hem tail is what physically locks the panel bottom down and stops the wind from ever getting a grip on the edge in the first place. Most DIY tutorials show you the fold happening, but they gloss over how much pressure and how many passes it actually takes to get it consistent across every single panel. Professional crews test their hem fold on a scrap piece first, check it against a template, and only then run it down the entire panel length. That consistency, panel after panel, is honestly the biggest visible difference between an amateur install and a professional one, more than the tools, more than the brand of metal. If you remember one technical detail from this entire video, make it this one. Consistency in that fold is what keeps water out for half a century. If your standing seam roof ever leaks, statistically it's not going to be the flat panel field that fails. It's going to be a flashing detail, somewhere the roof meets a wall, a vent pipe, or your ridge cap. Relying on caulk alone at these transitions is a mistake that shows up 2 or 3 years down the line, once the sealant starts to break down in the sun. Proper flashing, mechanically locked and layered so water flows over every seam rather than into it, is what actually keeps these junctions dry for the long haul. On a tiny house, you likely have fewer penetrations than a full-sized home, maybe a stovepipe vent and a roof vent or two, which honestly works in your favor. Fewer transitions means fewer chances to get it wrong. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this roofing style is perfect because it isn't. Rain sounds louder on metal, though most builders solve this with adequate insulation and roof decking, which you'd want in a tiny house anyway. It also transfers heat fast, so ventilation and insulation choices underneath matter more here than on asphalt. And if you do it yourself, mistakes are less forgiving than shingles. There's a real learning curve with the tools. This is not a roof you want to learn on your actual house. Practice the fold and the clip spacing on scrap panels first. Wind uplift is highest at the corners and edges of any roof, which is why professional installs use tighter clip spacing in those zones and wider spacing toward the center. For a tiny house that gets hauled down the highway, this isn't a theoretical building code number. It's something you'll actually feel. A properly installed standing seam system on a small roof like this can handle wind loads that would peel lesser materials off in a single trip. That clip spacing detail is cheap to get right and expensive to get wrong. When you add it all up, a properly installed standing seam roof on a tiny house is one of the rare upgrades where the math, the durability, and the aesthetics all point the same direction. You're looking at a few $1,000s, a roof rated for extreme wind, a 50-plus year lifespan, and a modern clean look that suits almost every tiny house style out there. The failures people run into almost always trace back to the same short list: wrong pitch for the panel type, rushed deck prep, over-tightened fasteners, and flashing details done with caulk instead of proper technique. Get those right, plan your panel widths before you frame, and get that full detail consistent, and this genuinely becomes the last roof decision you'll ever have to make on this build. If this saved you from a mistake you didn't know you were about to make, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe for more research-backed tiny house builds. No sponsors, just what actually works. See you in the next one.